Hi, everyone. Welcome back after a summer break. We're so glad that you are with us. Wait just 2 seconds while everybody is still entering the uh, event, and then we'll get started. Wow, we have 63 people. That is awesome. You guys are all awesome. Please, yes, put in the chat your name and your title, if that is okay, and your location. That would be great. That gives us a clue of who we're talking to and how to present in the future for everybody. So if you would do that, I would appreciate it. Thank you so much. Okay, we'll get started. We want to make sure we have time for this information because it's very important and we've been promising it to you. So I'm excited for you to be with us to hear more about trauma and how we work with it, use it as a lens, and as for those we serve and those who serve, because I think that trauma and that secondary trauma fits in both sides. So thank you for joining us. And so that is our title, to think trauma and think well-being. These are the regular disclaimer slides that we go through on a regular basis. This presentation was prepared by us under an NTAC contract, and it doesn't have, it's not produced by SAMHSA. So they're promoting and helping us with supporting this, but they did not produce it. So if you want to reproduce these slides in any way, Shannon, maybe you can tell them where you got them. We have some resources at the end of our slideshow that show where they came from. I think that's what they're for. Yeah, and then you're welcome to look them up, and that's what we're here for, is to help with that. So in case there's any security issues that may occur, this session will immediately end and will not resume using the same link. So Bridget will send out a new link if something happens. Thankfully, nothing has ever happened, so we'll just keep going that way, right? These are the partners with NTAC. All of the partners who do all of the great work, and there is a lot of information on NTAC's website. If you want to go there to find some more resources from any one of these partners, there's a lot of good information there. So our vision, the NTAC vision, NTAC is the National Technical Assistance and Training and Technical Assistance Center. Their mission is that all children, youth, and families living with and impacted by mental health challenges will have access to the resources and opportunities they need to thrive in a comprehensive and equitable system of care. And you can see in this wheel all of the great things that NTAC does. There are lots of things that are available to you and at no cost. So if you are in need of technical assistance, please go to their website and get that information. Just so you know, these are some questions that we generally get. You will get a certificate of completion. It will be coming to you from Bridget at CARS, and that's her website there. So if you don't get it for some reason, look in your junk mail, because everybody gets it. So if for some reason you don't, please go there first, and if it's still not there, we'll send it to you special. And in that email, or in an email that follows today, you will get a copy of the presentation. You should have received a copy of the presentation with your reminder to go to or to come to this event. But another one will be sent at the following. And a copy of this recording will be on the website listed here, but it will be in about a couple weeks before it is posted. So you will be able to watch it again if there's something that you missed. So welcome again to today's session. It's Think Trauma and Think Wellbeing. We're going to do some brief welcome and introductions. Introductions by way of chat. As you introduce yourself, I am watching that move along, and I'm thank you so much for putting your name and stuff in the chat. We're going to talk about why we're talking about trauma and doing the trauma-informed approach. What is secondary traumatic stress? And an activity we're going to be doing today is the personal balance wheel. And then we're going to talk about some strategies, how to deal with all of those issues. So that's our agenda for the day. Today, our presenter is Shannon Crossbear. She's part of the Fredla team, which an integral part of the Fredla team. So glad to have her and work with her on a regular basis. And I'm excited for you to learn more about her. And I'm going to turn time over to you, Miss Shannon.
Thank you, Lori. And I'm just going to greet you in my language. Anin Indaway Maganak. That means, hello, greetings as my relatives. And I really feel like coming to talk about this subject when Lori approached me and said, our group has identified that one of the things they want to learn a little bit more about is around trauma. I was very excited to be able to, come and join you and have those conversations. So I just want to say welcome and thank you for having me. This is just a picture about, some of my family members. Was taken a few years ago. My family's actually grown since then.
It's a beautiful family, Shannon.
Thank you. And I come to this work, just so that I come to this work from the place of being a family member, of being someone who has raised children, who have intersected with all kinds of child serving systems. And we have things that went well in those circumstances and things that didn't go well. And so I've kind of spent my time helping others in the process as we go through this together. And that's kind of what the sharing is about. So next slide, please. So, when Lori told me that one of the areas that the folks wanted to learn more about was trauma, and I really thought deeply about that, because we know from our work that our child and family serving systems have a high number of those affected by trauma. And years ago, I went to a annual conference of the Federation of Families for Children's Mental Health, and they had big conferences back in the day and in-person conferences. And there was a conference, there was, I think, around 700 participants, 700 to 900 participants that year. And I had just started to work with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And so one of the questions that we were asking at that conference of families was, did you experience trauma prior to your intersect with the system? Or did you experience trauma as a result of the intersect with the systems? And it was pretty surprising because, this was quite a few years ago, but what we were really finding was that our families were experiencing trauma. If they hadn't experienced it prior to their intersect with the system, that they were experiencing as a result of their intersect with the systems. And, and some of that showed up by having to tell one story over and over again, or other kinds of things that were happening in our system at that point in time. So it's really, and we know that even some of the information coming out today is really around the crisis of the mental health of our nation, and specifically of our young people. And so this issue of trauma is so critical to how we're on a path that is either healing or not. So, and most of the systems, they weren't designed to be trauma informed. They were designed to deliver a particular outcome, right? Whether it was the justice system that was designed to, to deliver justice, right? That with the education system was designed to deliver education. The mental health systems were designed to deal with just one's mental health, as if that could be detached from all other kinds of life conditions. And so, it hasn't worked very well. So the need is growing as we see more of the effects of traumatic stress that have come over time. And also because it's not just the traumatic stress that we're dealing with in terms of those that we are intersecting with, that we're working with families or children, but also the workforce itself. That secondary traumatic stress is now taking a huge toll. And of course, there were things that have contributed to that over the course of the last decade, and including the pandemic, including acts of violence, including racial and other kinds of disparities that have so affected all of us. So next slide. So that's kind of why. But it's heavy. I know this is heavy. I'm going to give you both kind of some information around trauma itself, but also then kind of what is the hope. But if something I'm saying or something that we're covering is particularly distressful for you, then I would just encourage you to step out, turn the monitor off for a minute, or the sound or whatever. Talk to somebody or do something that's regulating, even sometimes getting up or just taking a few deep breaths, or saying, I can rejoin in a minute or two, but right now I just need to take a break and take care of myself. So I want to encourage everybody to do that. So next slide, please. So, why are we talking about think trauma? And you can go ahead, Lori. I think there's several things on that particular slide. Is it really does talk about how we explain behavior. The difference between, I think one of the statements early on in the trauma field that came out that resonated with many was that the difference in not asking what's wrong, but rather what happened, and finding out how that behavior directly links to what is happening at the time really affects how we're going to handle it. The difference between, I'll use a very simple example of, a child who is taking food, who is stealing food. If you know that that comes as a direct result of food insecurity, as a result of being hungry and not having enough to eat, then your solution to that, or your assistance around that, would look different than if you have determined that that's just the behavior itself is what you're dealing with, and not the origins of that behavior. So it's not an excuse for that behavior, but it's an explanation for it. And once we know something, we have an opportunity to understand it at a deeper level. And once we understand something, then our approach to being able to really be of assistance increases. So it gives us more tools to make everyone safer, to be able to do our work in a way that doesn't escalate situations, but actually de-escalate situations, and is helpful for ourselves and for those that we work with. So next slide, please. So we have all these definitions of trauma that are out there, but when we talk about trauma, we're talking about an experience that threatens your life or your physical integrity, and that overwhelms you in the moment for your ability to cope, to think. And we'll talk a little bit about why that happens and how it's really a normal reaction for most people to experience this point at which our brains basically are getting hijacked by an experience or a trauma or a shock. So, but I'd say it's an experience. It doesn't have to be an experience that you personally experience, and that's the issue around secondary traumatic stress, is if you even are a witness to, or if you are being told the story, that that actually can be traumatic in and of itself. So it can result from an event or a series of events or a set of circumstances that is harmful and life-threatening. So, and it really does affect the way that we think and feel, and this idea of our well-being and our security. So next slide. So when we talk about, why do we even want to talk about trauma? Why do we really want to deal with it? Is that we're learning more and more about trauma, not just the trauma that an individual experiences in this lifetime, but the effects of traumas that have happened to people over time, and how that contributes to something called generational trauma that actually exists and affects our ability to fully be well, fully function, fully realize the dreams and hopes that we have. So we know that the ACEs, which is the adverse childhood experiences, any of those can lead to toxic stress. It could be a divorce or a loss of someone close, or not having a caring adult, or not having all of those kinds of adverse child experiences we know lead to negative outcomes, not just in childhood, but all the way up into adulthood on every level, physical, with higher degrees of heart issues, mentally, emotionally, all of the ways one considers being well. So that impact of that trauma and that toxic stress, it overwhelms our ability to cope. And if you think about it, even in a layered way, and just even you think about the last few years, and kind of, maybe it wasn't the first thing that happened, right? Whether it was 9/11 or other kinds of big social experiences, a school shooting, those kinds of things. It's not the single event. It's that those events over time, they accumulate until our ability to cope really gets reduced. And we see a lot of that, I think, right now, that people's ability to cope has been challenged by the excessive activation of our response systems that were meant to keep us safe, right? And yet are not operating in the same way. So next slide. So we learn by experience, and Lori, we had experience doing this video a little bit earlier, so we'll try it again. Okay, the story that goes with this is that if you can handle suspending your imagination, or suspending your reality for a moment to an imagination that you're walking down a path, and the path appears to be clear, but all of a sudden this is what's on your path. And as much as possible, if you can let yourself, and some of you may be, like me, not, a particular fan of the snake. And if you can even notice if you happen to be afraid of the snake, what happens to you? And you can just drop it into the chat. What's happening to you as you watch this? Increased heart rate. Yeah. Anybody find themselves just kind of breathing a little more heavily, or not even able to look at the screen, feeling stressed, sweating. Yeah. Also, even though we know, right, in our heads, we know that this is a video, and still these things will happen. Oh, I'm glad you turned your screen off if you have a phobia and anxious. Yeah. So let's go to the next slide. Feel the need to back up.
Oh dear. How do we go? There we go.
So everything that was there, feeling the need to back up, feeling anxious, holding your breath, all of those are the preparing for action, right? Even though this was a film, and we're going to go to the next slide, Lori. So these were just some of the things that people talked about, right? So now I want you to imagine that you're going down that same path, and this is in the road, right? But it takes you, I mean, we know it's not a snake. It's not a snake. It looks like it might be a cording of some sort, or could be something else that is there, but it's not a snake, right? We can know that, but the same thing starts to happen, meaning that surprise, I see a snake. Yeah, exactly. It's not a snake, and yet that's what happens, is that your mind goes back to your other experience. So even though that was a video, even though it's not in the room with you, your body reacts before your mind can engage. So next slide, please. And we talk about this because this is really what happens as a result of trauma. When I talk about it hijacks your brain, you can't think in that moment. It's the thinking is not what's going to happen. So, and yes, depending upon the severity of the trauma, you might be able to regulate and get back to that thinking fairly quickly. But if it's a significant trauma, it's hard to get back to that thinking, right? Because what engages is what I call that our dinosaur brain that sits at the back, right? And keeps us, it's the fight, fright, flight, fawn response that we have as human beings to keep us safe. And once that's engaged, it takes a while to re-engage what's happening in the front. So next slide, please. So, just in practical ways, so when you think about that, and you think about your interactions with with another family, with the youth that have been through something, you can begin to see that it isn't about thinking. You don't know what's happening because you don't have the full picture of what's underneath the iceberg, so to speak, or that they're carrying around in their trauma suitcase. And so a lot of times when we see a behavior, we only see the behavior, and we don't have an opportunity to really think about maybe what's happening in that moment is really about the fact that they are not able to think. They are not able to regulate as a result of their brain being hijacked in that moment. So yes, Alexa said, if I'm understanding correctly, once trauma is high, our brains are constantly in a state of flight or fright, which essentially would prevent actual focus on everyday things like schooling or work or being present. Yes, yes. And we have an opportunity to kind of regain some of that. So it really is that continuum of the environment and our ability to respond. And here's kind of the calm. We go from a calm state to an alert state to an alarm state to a fear state to a terror state. And in that process, and it can happen in seconds, as we kind of, as some of you experienced just through a video, right? You went from calm to the video, which some were just alert, some were alarmed, some actually went to fear, and some went to terror. And now the problem with kind of repeated traumas is we end up, just as Alexa said, we end up in the alert and alarm or fear state, and we get stuck in that state. So next slide, please. So when we think about how important it is to teach self-regulation, and we all know, I mean, probably every one of us in this room, virtual room, know that we've been taught self-regulation. Whether you were taught to count to 10 before you say anything, or whether you were taught to take a breath, or whether you were taught to go to your room and think about it. Now, all of those were ways of teaching self-regulation, of regulating, because once you regulate, you can begin to re-engage that frontal cortex, that thinking part of your brain that can give into the rational of what's happening now in the moment, as opposed to reacting to something that happened prior. So so it really is, you have to, but the first state is to regulate. That's why, you know, having people take a few deep breaths, you know, are so critical. And then you can begin to relate and actually get to reason. So next slide, please.
Shannon, did you see the feedback on exposure therapy from Desiree?
No, I did not see that.
It's lengthy, so I'll let everybody read it for themselves, but I want just to make sure that you knew that it was there. It's a link to further information, it looks like, yeah.
Okay,
Okay.
sorry, I did not see that. I'm not sure why it didn't come up on mine.
Looks
So
like good stuff.
great, great. Okay. So in that idea of toxic stress, we're thinking about, you know, that it decreases our ability to learn or respond. Like I said, your brain's been hijacked at that point. So figuring things out, it just the hormones, it makes the body not be able to fight infections. So that toxic stress takes its toll physically as well as mentally and emotionally. Emotionally for friendships. And the more that we have this kind of toxic stress happening, the more that we have a decrease for tolerance for any stress. And then, of course, that makes us feel unsuccessful. So next slide, please. So everyone, right? All of us have an invisible suitcase that, you know, it's what we may know and has been shared with us. It's made up of what you don't know, and finding out ways to know more and understanding there are things that you may never know. And I say that because, you know, how do you know more? You know, you can ask, but maybe that, even that whole thing, I don't know if anybody has been in a situation where you're being asked questions about about something and it feels more like an interrogation than an interest, than a really opportunity. So thinking about how are ways to know more that may not be direct questions. They may be expressed in a different way of creating that safety. So next slide, please. So when SAMHSA talks about a trauma-informed approach, they talk about these 4 R's. They talk about realizing just how widespread the impact of trauma is and understanding those potential paths for recovery. So when we think about that widespread trauma, there's the collective trauma that we've experienced as a nation. There's individual trauma that we've experienced as individuals, but there's also community trauma for those of you that have ever been in a situation where there's been community violence in your community, or there has been a natural disaster or an unnatural disaster, that the consequences of that really are kind of a widespread trauma. And you begin to see that, you know, trauma, the impacts of trauma are around us all the time, and we have to really be aware of that as we're interacting. So, and it really recognizes, they talk about recognizing the signs and symptoms. And so, especially in behaviors that, you know, seem out of the norm in our actions. So thinking about, you know, when that young child or when that adult or that young adult is acting out, that this may be a direct result of trauma, and how those interactions are happening. So, and being able to respond once you have that knowledge about trauma and putting in it policies and procedures and practices. So what do I mean by that? It could be as simple as, in terms of policies or procedures, is that you don't do that kind of intense interviewing in that first interaction with that family or with that youth. That maybe you find other ways to do that. Maybe the policy is that people are greeted in a different way. I know one trauma-informed tribal community, and it has changed their work so much that one of the things that they decided that they were going to do, because belonging was so important in that community, in all our communities, is that they were only going to refer to their clients in relative terms. And the first thing that they did when somebody got to their clinic was they gave them a glass of water, because water represented life and healing. It was considered the first medicine. So people were greeted by a relative term, meaning that they were greeted as a, you know, grandson or granddaughter or auntie or uncle or cousin, some way of identifying them as belonging, and then given a glass of water. So different than walking into a clinic and being handed a clipboard and a piece of paper. So you can see how that just is a different situation. So, and really resisting this, actively resisting re-traumatization. And I say that because, let's go back to what I was saying at the very beginning about how many families experience trauma as a result of their intersect with the system, as a result of their going to seek help. So we have to be ever mindful of how our systems themselves, or our helping systems, are actively resisting re-traumatizing the individual. Next slide, please.
So a couple of chats here.
Okay.
One is that Carly said she loved that you touched on how to gather information without making it feel like as an interrogation. And she goes on to talk about how she tries really hard to use reflective statements when gathering that information. So that was a really good thought. And then Alexa said, if I'm understanding correctly, once trauma is high on our brains, our brains are constantly in a state of fight or flight, which is essentially would prevent actual focus on everyday things like schooling or work, or just to be present.
Great. Yeah, both of the great comments.
Yeah.
And yeah, it is hard to be mindful of those things, but it really has to do with everything, with our language, how we treat each other, how we um are really thinking deeply about what behaviors contribute to being traumatized. So
Yeah.
next slide, yeah. So when we talk about trauma sensitive care and what that looks like, we're really talking about um, some of the things that are kind of embedded in what we would think of as a systems of care, or as our tribal communities call it, societies of care. That the needs really need to be identified by the individual, and even what safety means. Like, something that's safe for me may not be safe for you. And so safety has to be defined by the individual as well. And that individuals get to choose. It has to do with that self-sovereignty. The individual chooses the help that they want, and that the relationships are based on autonomy and connection. And that help is relational, it's reciprocal, that it's collaborative, that it's not top down. So those are some of the things that we can think about how that plays out in the places that we're working. So next slide, please. So you have to really look at everything, even our language. So much of in the helping fields, right? Some of our language is very traumatizing, and actually contributes to the way that we talk about each other. And people that speak several languages will tell you that when you speak in a language, you think in that language, and when you really are fully bilingual or trilingual, that when you switch and you're speaking in another language, it's no longer like speaking in English and then translating in your head, right? It's that you begin to think in that language. And when you think in that language, then that's the language that you're acting on. And so when we talk about trauma sensitive care, there was an elder that once told me, and said, it was a Lakota man, and I don't speak Lakota. I know a spattering of 2 or 3 words, but so we were in the same environment for a couple of days, and I thought he didn't speak English, and it wasn't till the 3rd day that I actually learned that he did speak some English. And so I was asking him why he didn't, communicate in English. And he said it was because it was the most violent language that he had ever learned. And so he didn't want to speak it. And so I had to think about that because there were, in his language and in Ojibwe as well, there are certain words that they don't exist. And so it's like really hard to, if that's the way you think and act. So the understanding the words that we use, such as, I don't know how many of you have worked on a grant application and you're working on, they want to know what your target population is. Well, I don't know about anybody else, but I certainly don't want to be a target. We can say it differently. We can say population of focus. We talk about evaluating our information. We capture information from people. We capture information. So think about those words. So it's in our language. It really is in our values, and it really means involving all of our staff, right? Understanding, that you have an organization that's sensitive to the fact that, I would say that almost all of the families and youth that you work with have histories of trauma, to some to a greater degree than others, but all that haven't experienced, because we have collective experiences with trauma. So these are some things just to think about, to really consider. Next Yeah, Carmen says, we can say what populations are you supporting as opposed to what.
Targeting.
Yeah, targeting, right. So next slide, please. So, we often talk about the traumas and the risk factors, and I often like to talk about, what makes up our resilience or our protective factors, because regardless, trauma in some of its forms has been around as long as we have as human beings. We've had traumatic events, right? And yet we've survived. So how does that, what are the protective factors? What allows us to be able to adapt to those things, to those experiences, including tragedy or threats or big significant threats? And I mean, I thought about this personally as I kind of was in my I lost a child to suicide many years ago, and I remember thinking about like people who became better as a result of tragedy, and people who became bitter as a result of tragedy, and knew that I had a choice to make, because I could have been forgiven in some respects, I think, for if I would have chosen to be bitter because it was a horrible situation. And yet that was, I had a choice to be better. So I really looked at what is it that creates those protective factors or that resiliency. And it's some of the same things that we talk about in terms of ACEs. It's about having somebody in your life. It's about relationships. It's about culture. It's about community. That all of these things are things that make up a kind of shield that offsets or that can protect one from the arrows of tragedy and trauma. So next slide, please.
And I just want to say, Shannon, that doesn't mean that you don't grieve anymore.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, in fact, this past month there was an anniversary that, I'm right back there. So, it
Yeah.
doesn't mean that we don't hold those things. It means that it's how do we continue on, and understand. For me, it was understanding that, joy and grief are two different things, and my grief could never diminish my joy, but neither could my joy ever diminish my grief. That they were two separate emotions, and that I could live and experience both of those emotions. So Deanna said 40 assets is a great list of protective factors. And so, yeah, if you can share that, that would be great. So next slide, please. So we talk about this. This is kind of more, I think, to me, academic in its language, but it really is about that individual's ability to think, to be able to act, and to be able to self-regulate and to have those coping skills, and spirituality, right? That's and I don't necessarily mean religion right there. I mean that sense of inter ability to connect. And then when we talk about, that supportive parent-child interaction, I would say adult to adult interaction as well. Our relationship with our peers, with extended families or communities. And why families? It could be families of choice. We don't define families in a limited way. And in your community, this is for young people, a positive school experiences, but it also for us is a positive work experiences, and engagement and kind of the social activities and an ability to have access to those community resources. And the 40 assets link did get put into the chat. So thank you. Thank you, Deanna. Next slide, please. So like I was saying before, this idea of trauma, it's layered, and we have multiple exposures increases our risk. And by that, I mean, it increases our risk to really have the ability to bounce back, so to speak, to have that resilience come to play. So, if you think about sometimes the thoughts that come into my mind, but I was thinking about the what is it, the battering ram that people use to try to get into the castle. If you've ever seen, that period movie where they're all lined up and they got the battering ram and they're hitting the castle doors, and it's not the first hit, it's not the second hit, it's not the third hit. Maybe they catch it on fire or something. It's, but at some point the doors break down. And if you think about our resiliency and our protective factors, that it's like that when you have these increased exposures, it's like that battering ram keeps going and going. So there's only so much that we can do while we're trying to decrease the risk that we are going to be affected by trauma. It could be personal circumstances, it could be historical trauma, the direct exposure, those that are from BIPOC communities or other socially marginalized and communities, that racial trauma that one lives with, and that strain for us, for many of those in the helping fields, that empathetic strain, meaning, day after day, you're really putting your heart on the line, so to speak, and experiencing the strain of being in that caretaking and caring position all of the time. Our work-related traumatic grief and loss, if you work in this field along the way, people are going to die, and some people will die by tragic experiences. Some people, it will be accidents, other accidents, it might be, this happens, this is life, right? So, but those traumatic grief and losses increase when you're in certain fields. And I often think about, I have sons who are carpenters, and now they're getting to be in their 40s and 50s, and their knees are shot. They have a lot of problems with their wrists from a hammer all day long for many years. They are considered part of that particular trade, that if you're going to be in that field, these are the kinds of things that happen to you. If you're in a field helping other individuals, that means that you are going to be exposed to traumatic stress. That means that your likelihood of experiencing secondary traumatic stress is very much increased just by the very nature of the work that you do. So next slide.
These are very hard stories that we all deal with on a day-to-day basis, and it can't help but have some kind of effect on us.
Right. And it's so important because that's that prevalence of of that exposure in our populations that we work with. But it's also many of us came to this work or come to this work as a result of our own pain. We stay because of our passion, but we got here, especially if you're a family member, we got here because something was happening that was not, that shook us, and that we wanted to make sure that other people were having a different experience than we did. So we're already kind of predisposed because of how we arrived into the work. And many people come to this work. It's not the only workplace stressor, but that indirect traumatic exposure is part of the work that we do. So they can lead to all kinds of things. And why it's so important that we're having these conversations now is because we have two things that are meeting at the same time. We have an overall mental health crisis for youth and young adults in our country. At the same time, we have an overwhelming workforce shortage, which makes our positions as family members, as relatives, as folks that are in community even more important and critical. And so it's so important that we start having and continue to have conversations about secondary traumatic stress. Next slide, please. So it really is that exposure to the details and thinking about what are those signs, anxiety, addiction, having our own startle responses, polarized thinking or numbing or denial, nightmares, depression, and entrenched cynicism. And I would also think that, or would also add that the inability to put the work down, like almost a elevated self-importance, like this, when you wake up in the morning and you're thinking about work, and when you, and the families that you work with, and when you go to bed at night, you're thinking about work and the families that you work with. That is another sign of secondary traumatic stress. Next slide, please. And here's just a this is a indigenous design from, I think, was it New Zealand or Australia? I'm not sure.
Australia.
Australia. And thanks, Lori. And it really talks about all of these things, like when we talk about well-being, these are all the things that contribute to our well-being, right? To our being on a path of wellness. And I like this graphic because even though there's a lot there, it's not too complicated, but you see that that in this particular graphic, they really are talking about all of the things that can contribute to that building a strong shield. So next slide, please.
It's a very pretty slide.
It is pretty. I like it. And this is kind of this, it's just a different way of doing it. So if you're looking at kind of how do you start to assess yourself? And I like to tell people get all nervous about assessments because it's kind of like, I'm just not going to go to the doctor because they might find something wrong and then I'll have to do something about it, right? So, but I always like to tell people this story about assessments is that I look at assessments like just an opportunity to take a look at stuff and give you more choices. When I was a little kid, I'd go to bed at night and then the light would be off and there'd be like this scary thing in the corner that, you know, I could see these shadows. I had no idea what it was. And I let my imagination go. It could be a lot of different things. And if I could finally get up the courage to turn on the light, and that's all an assessment is turning on the light. And then I could see that it was a pile of clothes there. And I'd be like, okay, now I had choices. I could probably turn the light off and say, fine, I know it's a pile of clothes, no problem. Or I could take that pile of clothes and I could throw it into my closet, which is probably the choice I would make, and close the door and then go back to bed. Or I could take those clothes and actually hang them up. But the point is that that's all an assessment is. And so we look at things and we say, what, you know, I like the personal balance wheel. Alan Rabideau, who recently passed, and myself worked on this because it's very simple. It really talks about how is it looking? How is our personal balance? And I think everybody, Lori, did everybody get a personal balance wheel?
No, I have it here ready to go. I'll put it in the chat right now.
Okay. And we're probably not gonna have time to do that today, but what I would like you to do is to take a look at this personal balance wheel. And all it is it really takes a look at how you're doing spiritually, emotionally, physically, mentally. And you fill out a wheel, right? And the point is that nobody's wheel is perfectly balanced. I'll say it right here, right now. Everybody can hear me. If you have a perfectly balanced wheel, I really want you to get a hold of me. I really want to talk to you because I have never met a human being that has a perfectly balanced wheel. But the point is that if you've ever, and you might have a personal balanced wheel and it's small, right? It's not full. It's kind of like that wheel that you have on your car. You know, when you have to put the donut on because you have a flat tire and you need to get that donut is only going to get you so far. You know, I think they tell you you can go 90 miles on it or something, and you still have to get your wheel back. But a wheel that is more balanced will last longer. So, but again, it's just an assessment. You can take a look at it and say, oh, yeah, I'm like not doing any very well at all in my um, physical well-being, and I don't care, and I'm not going to do anything about it. But I know it, or I might deal with it later, you know. So just oh, so Tika says she knows about that wheel. So
Small one?
yeah.
Yeah.
So and McKenna, she needs it.
I'll do that after this meeting. I will be sure to
Okay.
send it to you. Yes.
Perfect, perfect. Okay. So let's go to the next slide. I think it's a fun activity. It's not meant to be very heavy. It's just, gives you a sense of, hey, and what I do for myself is that I kind of take a look at that periodically. It's not like a one and done kind of thing. So I might decide that, oh, maybe I do need to have a little more social activity in my life than I have right now. And so I'm gonna, join this group for the next 6 months or something. And so I might do that wheel every 6 months just to kind of keep track of myself and see where I'm at. Okay, next slide, please.
Okay, just so everyone knows that balance wheel resource will be included in the follow-up email that goes out from NTAC. So you'll all get a copy of it. Thank you, Bridget.
Great.
And Kylene, I don't know if that's the right way to say your name, but uses a similar one in Hawaii. So that's interesting.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of those out there. That and you can choose ones. I mean, if you come across something that works better for you, that's fine. You can even go online and look for personal balance wheels or wellness wheels, and kind of take a look at them for yourself. So next slide, please. So when we talk about growing resilience, we talk about those, that caring relationship that we have with someone else. It doesn't have to be, I mean, this was really focused on youth and young adults, but, feeling connected to, our friendships are so important. Our communities are so important. And being appreciated and nurtured, these are all ways that increase our own resilience. So when we think about our workplaces, we can think about this as well, is that, do we have that now in our workplaces? Do we have, or do we have places where our abilities are nurtured, appreciated, acknowledged? So much of what we do, we just know about how much we have to do, and takes such little time to celebrate the accomplishments along the way. And yet that's critical, because we know that we build on strengths. We don't build on deficits. But if we don't take any time to celebrate those strengths, then we're kind of in that same place. Yeah, so Diana was saying that we battle the phone so much that talents and abilities is in grave jeopardy. So really, how do you begin to, set time aside? What does that mean? How do you do that in your, for yourself, but also in your organization or agency? Next slide, please.
Oh, I left something out. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, it's another way of, or another additional thing is, having control over one's life
Oh, another one.
and having a sense of belonging to the community. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, you know, I, for, we talk a lot about self-care, and yet we don't really take into account what self-care looks like for individuals. A lot of times, you know, there'll be kind of the newest, whatever the newest self-care is that, say you belong to an agency and says, oh yeah, we take care of self-care. We give everybody, a half hour, to go work out during their lunch hour, or we offer yoga, or we do, but that may not be what really feeds one, what really rejuvenates one, what really gives them that self-care. So it's important to kind of know for yourself. Yes, that Jess is saying, it's so important because you can't support someone else unless you support yourself. We've heard these things like, you have to love yourself before you love someone else. You have to care for yourself before you can care for somebody else. And sometimes when we hear something over and over again, we can dismiss it as opposed to embrace it. And what we really need to do is embrace that as a reality of understanding that
The one that you hear a lot is you have to put your own oxygen mask on before you can help others.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And yet we still seem to be challenged with that. So
Yeah.
and because there's mixed messages, like take care of yourself, but I'm going to send you an email at 10 o'clock at night and and if you happen to be my boss, then I'm going to feel like I need to respond. Right. Even if you say, even if you haven't explicitly said you need to respond to me right away, there's a power differential there. So it's a lot of times we might be saying, take care of yourself, and I want you to get this and this and this and this done. So that there's a conflict between those two things. So thinking about, what are what for yourself, really unpacking for yourself, what impacts, your idea of healing and self-care practices. Um, and, really understanding how you were socialized around pain or recovering from pain, or caring for yourself, right? Um, and taking the time like this, these are some heavy questions. Um, and it's important to kind of take the time to unpack this for yourself, especially that last question, which is what might for you promote or prevent you from engaging in kind of radical healing for yourself. Maybe it's a fear that if you really took care of yourself, that you would give less time to your work. And if you gave less time to your work, that you might not advance the way that you want to. This is not for anybody else. This is for you, being brutally honest with yourselves, to really get to what you might need to do in order to really be able to practice that self-care. So next slide, please. So if you happen to be a supervisor of others, really understanding, being present to that experience. If you have people you're working with who are exposed to secondary traumatic stress and or are experiencing secondary traumatic stress, it's okay if you don't understand what their experience is. Don't assume to pretend or know, but to be there to listen and to support. Those relationships, understanding what the differential is, just as I said, that you can be saying one thing, but your actions are telling you something that's different. So you really need to be aware of, the trauma that exists within your, the work that you're doing and uh, how that impacts, everyone. Um, yeah, Marlo says, we don't want to walk in with our clients and be frustrated because we have not taken care of our own mental and emotional state of mind. And that really has to do with, regulation as well. How are you? We're all human beings and we all have experiences, and we need to recognize that and honor that. At the same time, we need to suspend our attention on that in the moments when we're interacting. So next slide, please. So, again, this is for supervisors, if you're working with other folks, is to really be able to develop some of that natural cross cultural communication. Your own self-awareness as a supervisor, know what your biases are, and what your positions of privilege or your positions of oppression may be. And don't rely upon your BIPOC supervisors to be the teachers of everything that has to do with institutional racism. And I say this in colonialism because it's an extra added trauma and burden on individuals if they're the ones that are always gone to for that guidance. It's like using your one bilingual individual in your agency to do all of the interpretation and to that is not where when they were hired, not simply as an interpreter. So thinking about how we add to, that's a traumatic experience as well. So next slide, please. So understanding that it's, I think we have a little bit of an advantage as people who are working in the field with families, because we understand, many of us are families, and that we have our own trauma histories and ongoing trauma exposure. It's not like here's the trauma only exists during my 8-hour or 10-hour workday, but my trauma exists in my home, in my community. And so trauma is not, that's what we talk about, ongoing exposure. It's not just the trauma that one experiences in one's workplace, but the trauma that one is experiencing in those communities. And I think this idea of the strategy, why you want a diverse pool of folks that you work with, is really that you have more to rely upon in terms of those strategies for dealing with trauma. And some communities have a lot of experience with trauma and have been able to survive despite the really horrific kinds of conditions. And so being able to really tap into what I would call ancestral knowledge about how best to be able to do that is important. And the more people that we have involved, the more that we can draw upon that. And that goes to being open to new ways of responding that aren't necessarily Eurocentric, meaning, we have a medical model that we go by here in the West, and there are other ways of knowing that and other ways of responding to trauma that may look different in other communities, and we should avail ourselves of those opportunities to learn about that. and to really have folks learn about how to create safer spaces for providers, including reflective supervision. Next slide, please. So, yeah, Angela, Diana was talking about, she had a call with that recently, the white woman was being targeted by the rest of the class for other races. Yeah, that's a hard situation to be in. So, and that can be very traumatizing, and understanding that that has happened to, tapping into that experience when someone's in another position to really say, how do they deal with that? How does that trauma kind of express itself? And our first reaction is disconnection, kind of opposite of what we need, which is connection, right? So that's one of the things about trauma is that let's say you had a traumatic experience. They often talk about somebody who's had extreme trauma will do one or two things. They kind of like shrivel up and kind of hide inside, so to speak, or they disassociate and kind of hang out outside of oneself. And both of those things are not particularly healthy. And so this idea of how do we, at the very time that we're kind of trying to run away from something, do we really and disassociate and disconnect from others, is the very time when we need to be connecting. And so how do we create enough of a safe situation that people can do that? Angela talks about, she has finding a therapist that works well for her. And so she's trying to balance, she's semi-retired, but she's trying to balance, it sounds like, Angela, you're trying to balance being in the field and working with people and dealing with your son that has mental health challenges. And so that's always kind of many of us have those things going on at the same time. So organizations that really are, and even NTAC here about offering, awareness building and action planning activities for folks, and really being able to conduct an organizational assessment, looking at what's happening in an organization. So next slide, please. So when we talk about radical healing, we really have to begin with that self-awareness and developing pride in whoever you are, whatever your racial, ethnic, indigenous group, developing pride. And we can use that and say developing pride within the work that you do, right? Sharing your story, resisting when you see that that things may be traumatic or may be actually contributing to trauma, as opposed to not being, as opposed to being helpful. And
Is that the snake in the grass that we saw earlier?
Yeah, that's the snake.
Resisting that snake.
Yeah, resisting that snake and maintaining radical hope. I think this is one of the things we were talking about earlier today was, it's so important to maintain that radical hope that things can get better, and really practicing those restorative self-care practices. There's that whole thing of, and if you're in a leadership position, you have to demonstrate that. You can't talk about it. You have to demonstrate it. And meaning that you can't just tell people to take care of themselves. You have to actually model self-care and make it acceptable, and then provide the pathway. So next slide, please. So we have some resources here that really have to do with secondary traumatic stress. I happen to really like the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. and their secondary traumatic stress resources. And because I think that they're digestible, and the thing that they do that I really appreciate is that they have resources, not just for trauma types, and secondary traumatic stress, but they have resources that that are helpful to the average person, and you don't have to be a clinician to understand the resources or to be able to utilize the resources. And they have resources that are specifically for families. And they have resources that are specifically for professionals, clinicians. And I think families are professionals too. So I'll say clinicians, and for those who are in administrative positions as well. So that's why I'll make the case that if I was going to start somewhere on this list of resources, I would start with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Next slide, please.
So Marlo said that we also may need guidance from others that can help guide us to specific steps to start a healing process. And I really liked that comment, because it's not always easy for us to ask for help or to ask for guidance, because we want to have that appearance that we are, that we're self-sufficient, that we can do this.
Yeah.
But it's so important to know that you can ask for help.
Right.
Terry has a question. Yeah.
Yes.
Terry.
I'm so sorry. I was looking for the reactions because I wanted to put a thumbs up to that.
Oh.
Yeah, I
It wasn't a
absolutely agree with
question.
that. Yeah, it
Well,
was
you
just
stuck all
in
your fingers
agreement.
up. That's a good thing.
Yeah, so yeah, it's so true in terms of guidance. And I think the other thing that as we begin to really understand, and I don't like I need to find another word besides normalize, but as we really look at this is not something that happens to one person as opposed to another person, that we all have these experiences in secondary traumatic stress because of the work we are in. And typify, that's a great word, to just that this is typical. This is a part of our profession. This is a part of the work that we do. And as such, we have an opportunity, right, to address it. And to be able to do that in a way that doesn't make it has nothing to do with strength or moral failing or, any of those kinds of things. It just becomes eventually embedded in the way that we do our work. So next slide. Some more, these are some more resources. All of them are excellent around radical healing and how to cultivate that. So next slide, please. So really, I think today my call to action really has to do with, everybody in this virtual room practicing radical self-care, and it's not easy. It sounds like it's the easiest thing to do. But when you have to get past, getting your fingernails painted, or getting that massage, and you get down to the radical self-care that it takes to be able to say, I need to, disengage from the work for, 28, 48, whatever amount of time so that I can restore myself, and really regulate, get back to my self-regulation, that we're able to
I
do.
think anytime you add the word radical to something, that is a little more serious than just self-care.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
In my mind.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's what my call is, not just to say self-care, but to really, to have it a priority, right? To commit to those reflective practices that really help you to recognize and respond to your trauma and to the trauma that you see around you and all forms of distress. And We have a lot of that now, not just within our workplace, but within our communities and within our society as a whole. So being able to really spend the time to do, you know, what I would call is that, you know, forensic examination. And I mean that because, you know, in those, all the forensic shows, it's where they really take things apart and they look at them very deeply and all the different parts, because that really gives you more information. And to have some meaningful connections with other, you know, with us as other family members that may be professionals. We are professionals as family members, but we know that we can relate in authentic ways. And help to affirm each other's experience. That's what's so strong about the work that we do with families, and to call out and fight those systems of injustice when those opportunities arise. And I talk about using love skills, and love skills. We live in the world of acronyms, so you know you're either gonna embrace it and go with it, or you're going to create your own, or so love is an acronym for listen, offer, validate, and empathize. And if I think about a trauma-informed approach, it really does have to do with using those love skills. It really has to do with listening deeply, you know, offering what it is that you have to offer with permission, validating somebody else's experiencing, whether or not you understand it, you can still validate somebody else's experience. And then you can use your empathy, empathize with the experience. And those go a long way to creating an environment that is trauma informed. And yes, I agree, self-care has become trivial and gimmicky in mainstream spaces, when it is truly a personal practice that is realized. And I think that's what my point I was trying to make earlier was that it is individualized, and what self-care looks like for one person may not be the same as for somebody else. And you know, we all do crisis planning. I mean, not all of us, but many of us have done crisis planning in our lives, but we don't do self-care planning. You know, if we do, it's a note we have in our, you know, in our calendar that on Thursday, we're going to do such and such. And usually it's at the end of the workday. There's no self-care plan that really is more top loaded. Is that the word? And so yeah, so the really being able to, the wellness recovery action plan there, the RAP plan, yes, that's an example of really doing that kind of planning. So next slide, please. So this is just thank you in the Ojibwe language. It's Chi-miigwech, is the way you say it, Chi-miigwech, to all of you. And thinking about, we have just a couple more minutes, so I just wanted to open it up and give people opportunity to ask a question, to make a comment. This was such a light touch. It was kind of overall a light touch. If you are interested in kind of getting a little bit deeper into like specific strategies around trauma-informed care, and we go deeper, not just to think about trauma, but to really talk about trauma-informed care, let Lori know. We can always have a second session that really gets into some of the work of it.
A little deeper dive, yeah.
Yeah. So, but I want to thank you for allowing me to come and spend some time with you.
Yep, I see a vote for a second session, so we may work on that, Shannon. Thank you. I really want to thank you all for being here and for coming back after a hot July in Utah. I don't know where you live, but it was really hot here all of July. And I really am so appreciative that you were willing to share resources, because that is what this is for, is to help each other and to learn from each other. So thank you so much for doing that. And thank you for sharing strategies or whatever your thoughts were about the slides or whatever. That also, it helps us work. Please take time to understand, to become familiar with, and to use that personal balance wheel. And that will be included in your slides for tomorrow, that you will receive in the email that Bridget will send out to you. Couple more slides that just to finish off. We will have a September family exchange. We had not yet decided what that topic might be, and it might just be this trauma-informed deep dive if Shanna's available to do it on that date. We'll look into that, and I'll let you know when I confirm what that is. Bridget, I have a question. September starts the new year. Is this registration link on the bottom of this slide still correct, or will they get a new one that they have to re-register?
Guess what, Lori? Amazing. It's going to be the same link this year. No new registrations.
That's what I like. That's what I like. Do they have to re-register though?
They shouldn't have to.
Okay.
Zoom, as you know, does its own updates and things. And so sometimes people have to go, re-register just to log in quickly, but you will get the same reminder emails, same link and password. We're good to go.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, I'm glad to know that. Thank you. So look for your follow-up email. You'll get a certificate of completion. It will also include a copy of the presentation, and the recording will be available in a couple of weeks. We need to hear from you, so there will be a survey. If you have, Bridget already put it in there. The survey is in your chat. You'll also receive it as part of the follow-up email. Please take a few minutes to fill that out. It always helps us to know how we can get better, how we can do better and meet your needs in a more appropriate way. Big thank you to Shannon for your time and effort in this very important topic. You can tell by the chat that a lot of people engaged in this and know and want to know more about it. So thank you, Shannon, for your work. Stay connected with NTAC. Here's all of their social media things. And if you need any technical assistance, please call them. They will put you in touch with somebody who will be specifically assigned to help you with whatever technical assistance it is that you need. Okay, and just the contact information for NTAC. Okay, thank you so much, and we will see you all again next month, and I really appreciate you, and we'll see you again and cover more good stuff. Okay, thank you. Bye, Shannon.